God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
Did you know that you are not just a random clump of atoms buzzing around in a meaningless universe, but are actually a vital part of God's big plan for his world? What? You didn't even know that God had a plan? Well, no wonder you're looking so gormless. You can't take part in a plan if you don't know it exists. I'd better tell you about it then. But to do that, I'll have to go back to the very beginning. Once upon a time, there was nothing but God. Nothing had happened before God, and without God, nothing would have happened at all. But God liked the idea of things happening. So the first thing that God made happen was light. Light. It wasn't until the light appeared that you realized it was awfully dark without light, but all of a sudden, there it was. God called the light day. The second thing that God made happen was the sky. Somewhere to put all that light and dark. And next, God pulled together a huge pile of water under the sky, and he called it sea. The space it left behind, he called land. God looked at the sky, and the sea, and the land, and he loved it all. Then came the most exciting bit of all. God spoke to the sea and said the word, life. At that moment, the sea began writhing and wriggling, and little squirmy things appeared. Some of the squirmy things grew so big that they became whales, and others grew so long and stringy that they became octopuses. Many became brightly colored fish, and everything that hadn't shown much progress became plankton. Finally, God looked at the land. He paused for a moment. It felt as if everything waited. Go on then, he said. Let there be life. And there was. God was delighted. But this was just what he wanted. But although the earth had now become positively boisterous, something was still missing for God. I will make one more thing, he said. I will make something that is like me, so that it can enjoy all this with me. So that's what God did. God created a man and a woman in his image. That means that in some ways they were like him. They could love the way that God loved, and they could enjoy things the way that God did. God looked at the man and the woman, and he said to them, "You are the best thing I have made. You can look after my world for me." And after that, God took a rest. The man that God made was called Adam, and the woman was called Eve. The man and the woman had no need of clothes, and as neither of them felt embarrassed, they didn't wear any. God planted a garden for them in a place called Eden. It was very beautiful, and it was filled with fruit trees that Eve and Adam could eat from any time they liked. Now, in the middle of the garden were two trees that were special. One was called the tree of knowing, and the other was called the tree of life itself. The fruit of the tree of life itself was free for the man and the woman to eat. But God made the tree of knowing out of bounds for Adam and Eve. "Don't eat from that tree," said God. "It's not good for you, and in fact, you'll die." So, Adam and Eve trusted God and got on with life in the garden. It was great. There was just enough to do there to keep them occupied, and not enough to make them tired. Then, one day, a snake came into the garden. The snake was God's enemy rather than God's friend, but the man and the woman didn't know that. The snake was actually the devil, but the man and the woman didn't know that either. The snake went up to Eve and began cheerily. "Hiya, Eve. What are you doing?" Just harvesting this fruit tree, said Eve. The fruit on it tastes really good. Does it? Said the snake. That's nice. The fruit on that tree looks good as well. He focused his eyes on the tree of knowing. Does it? Said Eve. I hadn't noticed. God told us not to eat it. Really? Said the snake, with exaggerated charm. I think perhaps this God of yours is a wee bit jealous. God realizes that when you and Adam eat from this tree, you'll know as much as he does. And he doesn't want that, does he? Come over here and take a closer look. That business about dying is just nonsense. Eve opened her eyes wide. It had never occurred to her to doubt God before. Go on, Eve, said the snake. Look at how good it is. Are you really going to trust God more than you trust your own eyes? Eve took the fruit. It was soft. God probably didn't mean it when he said we'd die, she thought to herself. She squeezed the fruit. It was juicy. He was exaggerating to stop us from doing what we really want. Eve put the fruit to her lips and took a large bite. Adam came up. Looks like there's been a change in the weather, Eve, he said. There's a storm coming in from the east. Eat some of this, Adam, said Eve, handing him the fruit. You'll need all the help you can get if there's a storm. Didn't God say that we shouldn't? Asked Adam. He looked at Eve with a puzzled expression on his face. Eve laughed. What do you think, Adam? She said. I'm eating it, and I'm all right. Eve's eyes were slightly mocking. Adam ate the fruit. That very moment, the storm broke. The heavens opened, and it poured down rain. The skies flashed silver, and there was a great crack of thunder overhead. But Adam and Eve weren't worried about the rain and the storm. For the first time in their lives, they were worried about the way that they looked. We're naked, they said to each other. Oh, don't we look stupid? What shall we do when God comes? And at that very moment, they heard God's footsteps in the garden. Instead of running out to meet him, as they'd always done before, Adam and Eve ran into the bushes. They knew that something awful had happened, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. God spoke, and the storm went silent. Adam, Eve, where are you? Why are you hiding from me? We're naked, called Adam. And we look silly, called Eve. Who told you that you were naked? Said God. Then after a minute, he said, What have you done? What have you done? His voice sounded odd, deeper than ever before. They couldn't tell whether it was because he was angry or because he was sad. Leave my garden, said God at last. You are not fit to live here any longer. You have eaten from the tree of knowing, and you think you know yourselves, but you have shown that you do not know me. If you did, you would have trusted me. You will spoil my garden if you stay. Besides which, he added, next to the tree of knowing stands the tree of life itself. I was happy to let you eat of that once, but I can't do so now. You are too broken to go on forever. Now, I must let you die when you are old, which makes me very sad. Well, this made Adam and Eve very sad too. But they didn't really know what had gone wrong. They just knew that somehow they had gone wrong when they hadn't trusted God. And everything was spoiled. So, they left their lovely garden Adam and Eve didn't feel close to God anymore. In fact, they felt very alone. And God even put an angel on the gate to keep them from ever coming back. But as God watched Adam and Eve walk out from the garden, something in his heart was shattered. "You may not feel close to me anymore," he said to himself, "but I will always be close to you because I love you. And I will find a way to bring you back to me again. I will find a way to bring you back," said God, "if it costs me everything I have."
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
The first bit of God's plan didn't seem to turn out too well, did it? And unfortunately, after Adam and Eve, things got worse. Adam's children ended up backbiting, squabbling, and even murdering each other. God was heartbroken about this, because if you remember, he'd made men and women in the first place to be like him. The trouble was that God's plan always depended on people to make it work. So perhaps when they let him down, God had to think of a new plan to compensate for the things that had gone wrong. Still, God was determined not to give up. He loved men and women too much. The next bit of his plan was very clever. He decided to take a whole group of people and to build a special relationship with them, teaching them what he was really like and showing them how he wanted them to be as well. The idea was that once they'd got the hang of it, they could show the rest of the world. Well, that was the idea. "What?" thundered God. "What are they doing? Can't they trust me for just 1 second?" God was looking down from the mountain and seeing what Moses could not see. God's special people, the children of Israel, were bowing down and making sacrifices before an object that they had made, treating it as though it was God. This was a bizarre thing to do, because the object was in the shape of a cow, and the people had only knocked it up that morning by melting down their own jewelry. Why did they do it? Well, it's a long story, but basically it was because they'd got bored of waiting for God to do something exciting, and decided to take things into their own hands. "Oh no," said Moses. "Not again. I can't let this lot out of my sight for a minute." Moses had actually been up the mountain talking to God for 40 days, considerably more than a minute. But that wasn't really the point. The point was that without Moses to control them, the children of Israel seemed incapable of keeping loyal to God. Sound at all familiar? It had all started so well because Moses was a really good leader. Although he was probably quite macho, or most leaders were in those days, the Bible says that Moses was also the most humble man in the world. So seriously sorted was he in the ego department that God could turn up any time he liked and talk with Moses in person without it going to Moses' head. Moses loved God and did all that he could to obey him. But the people that Moses led were another story. They were called the children of Israel, and they might have been called the delinquents of Israel for all the maturity they displayed. God parted the Red Sea so that they could escape from slavery in Egypt. He supernaturally provided food and water for them in the desert. But none of it seemed to make any difference. The children of Israel specialized in being gripey and dissatisfied. They recalled every last detail of the setbacks they'd suffered. But when it came to thanking God for his goodness, they had a sudden memory loss. All this, as you can imagine, was a bit hard on Moses, and more than a bit hard on God. At last, God decided to get tough, turning up in person to show the children of Israel how he wanted them to be. "Moses," said God one day, "I'm about to get seriously supernatural. You see that mountain over there?" Yes, Lord," said Moses. "The one that looks incredibly high and difficult to climb?" "That's the one," said God. "I want you to meet me there in 3 days' time. Tell all the rest of the children of Israel to gather round and have a look. It's going to be quite spectacular." So, Moses gathered the children of Israel together. "Now, listen you lot. This is God coming to see us, not Great Aunt Matilda, so we want no larking about. Everyone's to wash themselves, wash their clothes, and be on their best behaviour. And remember, don't touch the mountain. God has said that he wants us to be an example to the rest of the world. So we'd better be prepared to do what he wants when he comes, haven't we?" The next morning, the people were woken early by the call of a trumpet. But the note was purer and more piercing than anything they'd heard before. And the sound got louder and louder till it resounded through the whole camp. It seemed to be coming from heaven itself. Trembling with fear, the people gathered around the foot of the mountain. And if they'd been frightened before, what they saw there nearly made them faint. The mountain looked like it was on fire. Great billows of black smoke rolled down to where the people were, and the mountain itself was shaking violently, as if it was about to be split in two. "Cor blimey," said one old man. "Is that God?" "Must be," said another. "I just never expected him to be so godlike, that's all." Grimly, Moses approached the foot of the mountain and started to climb. "I'll see you lot later," he said. "You're not going up there, are you?" someone cried out. "I certainly am," said Moses. "I've got an appointment with God, and I'm going on your behalf, so be thankful." Moses turned back to the mountain, and as he started to climb, the black smoke enveloped him. And that was it, more or less, for 40 days. Well, actually, that's not quite true. If you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that there was a bit more toing and froing than that. Moses went up and down the mountain a couple of times at the beginning, but after things got going, what basically happened was this. Moses stayed up the mountain and talked to God, and the children of Israel stayed down the mountain and talked to each other, and played the 15th century BC equivalent of tiddlywinks, and got bored. And eventually, as you heard at the beginning of the story, got into awful mischief. Who knows why it happened? Why would anyone choose to worship a model of a cow when they'd just seen the true God? Perhaps the children of Israel deliberately wanted to do what was wrong. Or perhaps they did it to get attention from God. Or perhaps they were just really stupid. Anyway, when they did it, God's heart was so grieved that he almost wiped out the children of Israel there and then. "No," said Moses, "don't do that. I'll go and sort them out." And off he went, storming down the mountain at about 150 miles an hour, carrying with him the 2 precious tablets of stone that God himself had just inscribed with the most important advice in the universe. Oh, I haven't told you about those yet, have I? Well, those 2 stone tablets were probably the main reason that God had come down to earth to talk to Moses in the first place. God had written them out himself with his 10 most important pieces of advice for the human race. They were to show people exactly what God wanted and to make it easy for people to follow his ways. Moses, hared down the mountain, still holding the tablets. But when he reached the bottom, he was almost sick at the sight that met his eyes. God's special people were dancing and cavorting before the statue of the cow, bowing down to it and crying out, "Hail, mighty one, we worship you." Moses looked for a few moments. Then he let out a loud howl. "Oh, how dare you!" cried out Moses. The children of Israel stopped what they were doing abruptly. Everyone looked embarrassed, but a few people sniggered behind their hands. "There's nothing in it," cried one. "We were just having our bit of fun." "Nothing in it," growled Moses. "You've made a mockery out of the Most High God, that's all. How can God put up with you? You don't deserve to know him, and you don't deserve to know his ways." And with that, Moses took the stone tablets that God had just given him and threw them down against the side of the mountain. The tablets landed with an ugly crack, then broke into pieces at Moses' feet. "What was that?" asked a young woman. "That was the most important advice in the universe," said Moses. "How to live at peace with God." A deathly silence fell on the children of Israel. People stood and gawped at the stone tablets, or what was left of them, and someone began to cry. "Oh dear, we've blown it now," whispered the woman. "You certainly have," said Moses. "You certainly have." But that's not the end of the story. It never is with God. God always wants to forgive people if he can, and that's just what he did with the children of Israel. And he even wrote out the Ten Commandments all over again. Yes, the Ten Commandments. That's what those stone tablets came to be called. You've probably heard of them. They became ever so famous. Anyway, God gave out a second set. Have you got any idea what the Ten Commandments say? Well, if you don't, here's an updated version. Number 1, make God your number 1. Worship him, follow him, and always try to please him. If you're doing all that, you won't go too far wrong. Number 2, don't put anything else before God. Number 3, never use God's name as a swear word. Number 4, have a day off once a week. Well, God took a rest when he made the world, and so should you. Number 5, always respect your mum and dad. Look after them when they get old. Number 6, don't kill anybody. Number 7, don't have sex outside marriage. Number 8, never steal. Number 9, never lie. And number 10, don't be jealous of what other people have. It's one thing to know the Ten Commandments. It's another thing to live by them. That's what the children of Israel found out anyway. Are we any better at keeping God's good advice today? What do you think?
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
The second bit of God's plan didn't seem to go much better than the first, did it? Men and women just couldn't seem to keep God's ways, however easy God tried to make it for them. But perhaps in the long run, even the plan seeming to go wrong was actually part of the plan. What do you think? It showed people that they were in a state, and that they needed help. But the next bit of God's big plan was his masterstroke. Why? Because it didn't rely on men and women to make it work. It only relied on God. There was nothing we could do to mess up this bit of the plan. In fact, the more we messed it up, the more it worked. It was late at night in a garden just outside the Jewish city of Jerusalem. One man was on his knees. He was crying as though his heart would burst. Around him were a group of other men, but they'd all fallen asleep. "Oh, Father," called out the man. "Father, please hear me. If it's possible, don't let me have to go through with this tomorrow. You know I don't want to die. If there's another way, Father, please find it." The man looked up to heaven, but heaven seemed to make no reply. The night was still and clear, but only the crickets' chirping broke the silence. The man called out again, "Father, Father, you know I'll do anything to save them, but does it really have to be this?" A heavy sweat broke out on the man's face. It almost looked like blood. But after a while, although nothing changed on the outside, it seemed as if something did change on the inside for the man. It was almost as if someone was right there, comforting him. His sobs subsided, and he nodded several times, then got up from the ground. "Very well, Father," he said. "I'll do it. If there really is no other way. I love them all too much to let this thing slip." And after thinking for a moment, he began to wake his sleeping companions. "Come on, you lot," he said. "Where are you when I need you most? Don't you realize I've had a horrible night?" "Sorry, Jesus," said one of the other men, waking with a start. "Oh, is it morning time already?" "No, it isn't," said Jesus, for that was the name of the man who'd been crying. "But they'll be coming for me soon." "Who'll be coming for you?" said one of the other men with a shiver. "What do you mean, Jesus? You've been giving us the frights all night with all this talk of them coming to get you. I don't understand what you're talking about." But just then, a crowd of people turned up. They weren't a very nice crowd. As well as carrying burning torches, they had clubs and spears and swords. They were led by an odd little man with a twisted face, who managed to look guilty and angry at the same time. "Does it end like this, Judas?" said Jesus sadly, as the little man ran forward to greet him. But Judas could not look Jesus in the face. "What are you doing here?" said one of Jesus' other companions, glaring at Judas. But before Judas could reply, events had taken their own turn. "Get him," said one of the men carrying clubs and swords, and within moments, Jesus was bound hand and foot and was dragged off towards the house of the high priest. The next day, it all happened. It happened just as the prophets said it would. For Jesus' friends, it was a disaster. For the rest of the world, it was a bit of a shock. But for God, it was actually part of his plan. Although it has to be said that God's big plan for his world was the strangest plan that there ever has been. Only God could have thought of it, and only God would have had the nerve to carry it out. They killed Jesus. They killed the man who Christians believe was the Son of God. He was the best man who ever lived. And for some reason, they took him out and strung him up on a tree with nails through his hands and his feet and left him there until he died. Why did they do it? Human jealousy and pride had a lot to do with it. But at the back of it all lay God's mysterious way of saving his world the hard way. "I can't make it," said Jesus. "I can't make it." "Yes, you can," snarled the Roman guard. Jesus' back was bleeding where he'd been whipped, and he was finding it hard to carry the heavy piece of wood to the place where they would kill him, the place that was called Skull Hill. "I'll tell you what, let's give him a friend to help him," laughed the soldier. And without asking anyone, they grabbed a passerby named Simon. "Here, you, come and help with this," they laughed. and together, Jesus and Simon staggered up the hill. Although it was early in the day, it was already hot, and the sun was baking down. When they got to the top, they laid Jesus down on the piece of wood. Then they hammered nails into him to make him stay put. Then they lifted the wood high and fixed it to an old tree so that it looked like a cross. Then they just left him there to die. Loads of people gathered round to gawp at him. They weren't very nice people. Hey, hey, hey then, Mr. Miracle Man, they called. You've done enough favors for other people. Why don't you do one for yourself? Come down off that cross if you really are God's son. Jesus didn't say anything. He just moaned. On either side of him, they strung two other men up to die. Both were criminals. One of the men joined in with the crowd, making fun of Jesus. But the other man didn't. Don't you fear God at all, he said. You know that we're suffering for our just deserts, but nobody can say a word against this man. Everybody knows that he's not done something wrong. Jesus, he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Yes, of course I will, said Jesus, panting slightly because he could hardly breathe. In fact, this very day, I'll take you with me to heaven. And that was it. That was how they killed the Son of God. They say that the sky went dark, as if God couldn't bear to look at what they were doing to his Son. Jesus called out in a loud voice, Father, please take me. And at that minute, he died. The funny thing was that as soon as it had happened, people started wishing that it hadn't. Those standing around wrung their hands and went home frowning, as if they knew they'd done something wrong. And one old soldier who was standing there couldn't stop thinking about the way that Jesus died. He'd seen lots of people die before, but none like this. This really was quite a man, he said, and he worshipped God. You see, God's big plan for his world is a mystery almost beyond figuring out. But the high point of it all was actually the low point of it all. When Jesus died an unfair, miserable death, it was as if God was saying, I will even die for you, my people, or I will let my son die. I will let him take what you deserve, so that if you trust me, you can have what he deserved, a place in heaven with me. Jesus died for us because he loved us and because he thought we were worth dying for. But remember, my story's not over yet, and God's big plan for his world isn't finished.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
If last time's story is the most mysterious bit of God's plan, then today's story must be the most incredible. How could God turn something as miserable as Jesus dying into something really wonderful? How could he? Any ideas? It was nearly evening, and the two friends trudged wearily along.
How much further is it?
Said one. Oh, I don't know, said the other. Another couple of miles. But I don't care if we never get there, he added abruptly. What does it matter anymore? What does anything matter?
Cheer up, Cleopas, said the first. It's not all that bad.
Oh, isn't it? Said Cleopas. Well, you let me be the judge of that. They killed him, burst out Cleopas suddenly. They killed him as though he were a dog. They just strung him up on that tree and left him to die, like he was an animal, and none of us could do anything about it.
Yes, I know, said his friend.
And he just hung there and died, said Cleopas.
Yes, I know,
said his friend. But how could he, said Cleopas. He was supposed to be God's special one, the one who was going to sort us all out. How could he die?
Well, he did,
said his friend sadly.
He died just like the rest of us. That's all there is to it. It's over now, so we better just get back to life as normal.
Normal, said Cleopas with tears in his eyes. I shall never be normal again. The friends both looked down at their feet. You'll have gathered by now that as well as being friends of each other, the two men had been friends of Jesus. It was only a couple of days after Jesus had been killed, and they were very, very upset. Little did they know that this was the day that God would launch the next big part of his plan for his world. A stranger drew alongside them. That's just what we need now, muttered Cleopas under his breath. Company. But the stranger seemed nice enough. What are you two looking so glum for? He opened cheerily.
Don't you know?
Said one. Know what? Said the stranger.
About all the horrible things that have been going on in Jerusalem. They killed Jesus the day before yesterday. He was the one we all thought had been sent by God because he was so powerful and supernatural. And he did miracles and things. We all thought, this is it. God has finally come to restore his people. And then it all went wrong, and they killed him.
What's more, said Cleopas, some of the women who are part of our group came back this morning with some cock and bull story that he was alive. Well, it must be nonsense, of course, but it's left us all shaken up. The friends looked down at their feet again. You're a bit slow on the uptake, aren't you? Said the stranger. I beg your pardon, said Cleopas. Didn't you realize that God's special one had to die like that in order to complete the work he had to do here? Said the stranger. Eh? Said Cleopas. Yes, said the stranger. And starting with Moses and the prophets, he began to explain all about God's big plan. How God had given people chance after chance of getting close to him, but when they simply didn't do it, he had actually come into the world himself to sort it all out. How he'd shown people the right way to live, and then ultimately been prepared to carry the can for the fact that they'd lived the wrong way for so long. The stranger talked on, and as he talked, it started to make more and more sense. Eventually, the two friends had to turn off to Emmaus, the little village where they lived. But the stranger acted as if he was going further. Oh, no, don't go, said Cleopas. I was really enjoying talking.
Besides which, said his friend, it's too late to travel far. Oh, come and stay the night at our place instead.
The stranger looked back at them. His eyes were warm and friendly. They reminded Cleopas of someone. All right, said the stranger, and they made their way into the village together. Is bread and cheese all right for supper? Said Cleopas, after they'd laid the table. I'll say, said the stranger, but I warn you, I've got a good appetite.
It's all right, said the other man. So have we. You've made us feel much better, you know.
So they all sat down to eat. Will you do the honours and thank God? Said Cleopas to the stranger. Oh, by the way, we haven't even asked you your name.
But the stranger was already beginning to pray. "Father, thank you," he said, as he tore the loaf in half. And just as he said, "Father," the two friends looked up in amazement. They both gasped. It was Jesus. Jesus was the only person that they knew who talked to God like that. But even as they looked up, the stranger had gone. "Didn't you feel happy as he was chatting to us on the road?" said Cleopas excitedly, jumping up on one leg. "And didn't your heart do a somersault as he explained all about God's plan?" said his friend. "It was Jesus!" Suddenly, it all made sense. "Quick, let's get back to Jerusalem and tell the others," said Cleopas. "There isn't a moment to lose." Neither of the friends was quite sure why there wasn't a moment to lose, but they both went off like tornadoes anyway. You wouldn't believe the journey that had taken them so long earlier in the evening could now be done so quickly. The two friends ran along through the darkness, laughing every time they tripped over a rabbit hole or a bit of scrub. At last, they got to the house where the rest of Jesus' followers were. "It's true! It's true!" the two friends whooped breathlessly as they ran up the stairs and burst in through the door. "Jesus has come back from the dead! He's definitely alive," added Cleopas, sinking down in an old wooden chair and gasping for breath. "I saw him myself. You'd never believe it. The women were right."
God's big plan for the world.
Mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest,
God's big plan for the world.
mega quest, mega quest, mega quest.
We found out a lot about God's big plan for his world. How God made men and women in the first place to be his friends. How they wandered off and went their own way. How God tried to show them the right way to live, but they wouldn't listen. And how eventually God came down as Jesus to sort it all out. We found out last time that after Jesus had died on the cross, he actually came back to life to prove that he wasn't just an ordinary man. But what about us today? What difference does it make? Well, because the Bible says that Jesus is still alive, we can still come to know God through him. We don't need to wonder what God wants for our lives anymore, because if we ask him, Jesus himself will show us. You see, God hasn't just got one big plan for his world. He's also got a special, individual plan for each one of us. God wants us all to come to know him and to be his friends. That's how he makes his world better, little bit by people who are prepared to live for him today. The world is a messed up old place. Most people don't care about God much. They want to do their own thing, and their own thing isn't always that nice. But if you love God and want to live for him, Jesus will give you the power to be a vital part of God's big plan. God can change his world through you. But one day, the Bible promises that God will change the world completely to make it the way that it should have been in the first place. This is the last part of God's big plan for his world, and it's probably the best bit.